the Forest of Shadows. In the remote northern regions, there was a forest known by the locals as the Forest of Shadows. This forest was notorious for its mysterious events and sudden disappearances. No one dared to venture into it alone, as it was said that anyone who entered would never return. One day, a group of friends with a penchant for dangerous adventures decided to explore the Forest of Shadows and uncover its truth. Equipped with all necessary gear, they set out early in the morning. As they approached the forest's entrance, a thick, heavy mist enveloped the area, and strange animal and bird sounds echoed all around. With a mix of fear and excitement, the friends entered the forest, following unusual and eerie tracks on the ground. The deeper they went, the less sunlight reached the forest floor, and the darkness and shadows grew longer and more menacing. After some time, they reached a dark, open area. Here, the trees were bent in bizarre ways, and it felt as if the forest itself was watching them. Suddenly, one of the friends shouted, "Guys, look at this!" They rushed towards the source of the voice and found an old, abandoned cabin in the middle of the forest. The door was ajar, and strange whispers emanated from within. With fear and hesitation, one friend gently pushed the door open and stepped inside, followed by the others. The interior was dark and cold. The walls were covered with strange and frightening drawings depicting unknown creatures. In a corner of the room, they found an old, dust-covered journal. One friend picked it up and began to read. The journal contained stories of people who had entered the forest and never returned. With each page they turned, their fear and dread grew stronger. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps came from outside the cabin. They looked out in terror and saw shadows approaching the cabin. In a panic, they dropped the journal and ran into the forest. The further they ran, the more they felt the forest was alive and pursuing them. Strange noises came from every direction, and shadows moved between the trees, closing in on them. During their frantic escape, one friend suddenly fell to the ground, screaming in pain. The others ran to help and saw that his leg was caught in an old trap. With trembling hands, they struggled to free him. The footsteps and whispers grew closer, and the shadows loomed nearer. Every passing moment increased their terror and desperation. After a strenuous effort, they finally freed their friend's leg and continued running. The shadows seemed to draw closer with every step. Exhausted and out of breath, they reached another open area. Here, a faint light from the sun filtered through the trees, and they managed to find their way out of the forest. They ran with all their might towards the exit and, upon emerging from the forest, felt as though they had escaped a terrifying nightmare. Outside the forest, they took deep breaths and looked at each other. None of them ever wanted to return to that forest. But the story of the Forest of Shadows did not end there. After that ordeal, one of the friends fell severely ill. He had terrifying nightmares every night and grew weaker by the day. He constantly spoke of shadows that were following him and trying to take his life. In the end, he died under mysterious circumstances. The remaining friends realized that he was not the first victim among them. Another friend also suddenly disappeared, and no one could find him. Each of the survivors lived in constant fear, knowing that the forest's shadows were still after them. The Forest of Shadows remained one of the most terrifying and mysterious places in the collective memory of the villagers, and no one dared to approach it. The villagers believed that anyone who entered this forest was doomed, and their fate would forever be entwined with the forest's haunting shadows. The Haunted Cabin. In the depths of a dark, dense forest, there was an old, abandoned cabin. Locals referred to it as the Haunted Cabin and told many stories about it. It was said that many years ago, a man named Jack lived in this cabin. He mysteriously disappeared, and since then, his ghost has been wandering around the cabin. One day, Three friends decided to spend the night in the cabin to prove to their friends that these stories were nothing but myths. They entered the cabin with their cameras and flashlights. The cabin was dark and cold, and the smell of mold and decay filled the air. The walls were covered with moss, and the windows were broken. As they climbed the wooden stairs of the cabin, the creaking sound of the steps filled the space. As soon as they reached the top floor, they suddenly heard the sound of a door closing from a room at the end of the hallway. One of the friends, hesitantly, walked toward the room and opened the door. Inside, there was only a large old mirror. They approached the mirror and saw a mysterious, shadowy figure slowly moving within it. Terrified, they quickly left the room and went back downstairs. Suddenly, they heard footsteps coming down the stairs. The sound of the steps seemed to be getting closer. They pointed their flashlights at the stairs but saw nothing. Then, a cold, eerie laugh echoed through the cabin. One of the friends felt a cold, invisible hand resting on their shoulder. They decided to leave the cabin as quickly as possible. However, when they reached the front door, they realized it was locked. One of them tried to open the door but couldn't. At that moment, a faint, desperate cry was heard from a nearby room. They walked towards the sound and opened the door. Inside the room, there was an image of a middle-aged man staring at them with terrified eyes. Suddenly, the image of the man started moving towards them. Panicking, they ran out of the room and desperately tried to unlock the front door. When they finally succeeded, they rushed out of the cabin and ran into the forest. As they fled, they felt a cold, biting wind coming from within the cabin, chasing after them. After escaping the cabin, the friends, still terrified, looked at each other and realized that something truly frightening was inside that cabin. They decided never to return, and the local stories might be more than just myths. From that day on, every time they looked at the cabin, they felt invisible eyes staring at them from behind the windows. But that wasn't the end. After some time, one of the friends began experiencing horrific nightmares. In his dreams, he found himself back in that cabin, hearing incomprehensible whispers leading him to a room. Every night, he would wake up in terror, and these dreams grew more intense and realistic over time. The other friends also suffered from similar nightmares. It seemed that something from the cabin had followed them and now haunted their dreams. After some investigation, they discovered that the cabin once belonged to a man who was brutally murdered by one of his relatives. The man's spirit was still trapped in the cabin, and anyone who entered would be followed by him. With the help of a paranormal investigator, the friends decided to return to the cabin and put the spirit to rest. Armed with the necessary equipment and a lot of courage, they went back to the cabin. The investigator began performing a ritual to calm the spirit. During the ritual, the sound of crying and whispers could be heard from all directions. The friends, scared but determined, followed the ceremony, and eventually, the cabin grew silent. After that night, the friends' nightmares ceased, and they never again felt those terrifying eyes watching them from the windows. However, the haunting experience stayed with them for the rest of their lives, and they never forgot that sometimes local legends are far more real than they seem. The Cursed Forest. On a dark and foggy night, a group of friends decided to venture into a forest on the outskirts of their town. This forest was notorious for the scary stories told about it. People said it was cursed, and no one who had entered had ever returned. The four friends drove towards the forest in an old car. As they approached, the fog grew thicker, and the car's headlights barely illuminated the path. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the louder the sounds of crickets and owls became, and the air grew colder and damper. After driving for a while among the tall trees and dark shadows, they decided to park the car and explore the forest on foot. With their flashlights, they began to navigate the narrow, winding paths. With every step, they felt as if shadows were following them in the darkness. Suddenly, one of the friends shouted, "Guys, look at this!" They ran towards the source of the voice and discovered an old, abandoned house among the trees. The door was half open, and strange sounds emanated from within. With fear and hesitation, one of the friends gently pushed the door open and stepped inside, followed by the others. The inside of the house smelled of dampness and decay. The walls were covered in moss and cobwebs, and the floor was strewn with dry leaves and branches. Suddenly, a faint laughter echoed from one of the rooms. They moved towards the sound and opened the door. The room was dark, with only a small window letting in a sliver of moonlight. In the corner, an old woman with a terrifying face and soulless eyes was sitting. She looked at the friends and said softly, "You've come seeking the truth, just like the others?" With fear in their eyes, one of the friends asked, "What truth?" The old woman, in a hushed and eerie voice, replied, "This forest is cursed. Anyone who enters never finds their way back. By morning, you'll be trapped here, and if you can't escape, your souls will join the others in this forest." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the friends found themselves alone in the darkness with the old woman. They tried to find a way out, but every door they opened led back to the same room. Fear and panic overtook them as strange noises echoed from all directions. Hours passed, and their fear grew with each moment. Finally, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the small window, the doors slowly creaked open, and the friends managed to escape the house. They ran to their car and, without looking back, sped away from the forest. After that night, no one dared to go near that forest again, and the friends never spoke of that dark and foggy night. The cursed forest remained one of the most mysterious and frightening places in the collective memory of the townspeople. The house under the tree. On the outskirts of a small, remote village, there stood an old, forgotten house located beneath a massive, ancient tree. This house was known as the House Under the Tree, due to the large tree casting eerie shadows over it. Locals had long regarded this house as a place of malevolent spirits and dark omens. The stories of hauntings had made it a place nobody dared to visit, and many villagers avoided it entirely out of fear. One day, three friends with a keen interest in local legends and horror stories decided to spend the night in the house to prove to their friends that these tales were nothing more than myths. Armed with cameras and flashlights, they ventured into the house. As they approached, the massive tree's shadows cast strange and unsettling shapes around the house. The interior of the house was enveloped in darkness and cold, and a musty, damp odor filled the air. The walls were covered in mold, and parts of the ceiling sagged ominously. As they entered the house, they immediately noticed how the air inside was strangely cold and heavy. The walls were draped in moss, and the broken windows allowed the moonlight to create eerie patterns on the walls. As they climbed the creaky wooden stairs, the sound of the steps echoed throughout the house. Each friend cast nervous glances around as they ascended. When they reached the upper floor, they suddenly heard the sound of a door slamming shut from a room at the end of the hallway. One friend, filled with trepidation, walked cautiously toward the room and opened the door. Inside, there was only an old, dust-covered box. With curiosity, they approached the box. One friend reached out and slowly opened it. Inside, they found a collection of antique jewelry and items that seemed to be from centuries past. Suddenly, as the box was opened, a faint, mournful wail was heard coming from somewhere in the house. The sound clearly came from the basement. One of the friends, braving the eerie atmosphere, went to the basement door and opened it. Slowly, with a flashlight in hand, they descended into the basement. The basement was extremely dark and damp, with a foul stench pervading the air. There was only an old, dusty wardrobe in the basement. When they opened the wardrobe, they discovered more old boxes and items inside. But suddenly, loud, Terrifying cries and screams echoed from above. They quickly returned to the upper part of the house and saw that the ceiling was beginning to tremble. It seemed as if the house had suddenly come alive and was reacting in a terrifying manner. Strange, ominous shadows from the surrounding trees were projected onto the walls, forming terrifying images of figures with frightening faces. In a state of panic, the friends tried desperately to open the front door, but it was locked, and all efforts to unlock it were in vain. At that moment, the large tree beside the house began to shake, and the surrounding trees also swayed violently. Shadows from the trees cast nightmarish figures on the walls, creating terrifying scenes. The friends, now in a state of sheer terror, decided to leave the house as quickly as possible. When they finally managed to open the front door, they fled the house and ran towards the village. As they escaped, they heard a cold, eerie laughter from behind, seemingly following them. After that night, the friends were never able to sleep peacefully. The nightmares and fears from that night haunted them every night. They vowed never to return to the house under the tree and began to believe more deeply in the local legends. From that day on, every time they looked at the large tree beside the house, they felt those terrifying shadows still watching them, and every faint sound sent shivers down their spines.